Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Katie Fleming, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology. Before we get started today, I just wanted to take a minute to thank you all for being here and go over some Zoom basics. I'm really excited to announce that we have 500 people here in this webinar and another, close to 200 people watching on YouTube. So I'm really thrilled that we have such a large audience for this event. For those of you in the webinar, please take a moment to review some of the control options that are on your screen. To enlarge or otherwise change your screen size, you can click the View Options button at the top of your screen. To change your audio output, click the Audio Settings button, which is at the bottom left of your screen. And if you're hearing an audio delay or you're hearing an echo, it might be that you have both the Zoom webinar open as well as the YouTube live stream. So feel free to either just watch the webinar and close the live stream, or do the opposite. You can close the YouTube live stream or leave the webinar and just watch the live stream. And if you're viewing this event on a device other than a computer, there's more information that we're going to drop in the chat about how to use those various functions. Lastly, I just wanted to let everyone know that there's closed captioning available for this event today. So if you'd like to view the captioning, just click the closed caption button to start viewing that at the bottom of your screen. You can also adjust the size of the captions as well as the location of the captions on your screen. Lastly, I just want to let everyone know that you can feel free to submit questions using the Q&A throughout the program today by using the Q&A box, which can be used seen by clicking the button that says Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You can either submit your own question or you can upvote another person's question, and we'll be posing those questions to the panelists at the end of the program today. For those of you watching on YouTube, we'll be providing contact information for the panelists at the end of the program. So if there are any questions that didn't get answered during today's event, feel free to reach out either to one of the supporting institutions or to the panelists themselves. So with all that said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Feely Lee, who is the program director of programs and who's the director of programs and grants at the Ethnic Arts Council of Los Angeles, who's going to be introducing today's event. So thank you, Feely. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Katie. To our nearly 1,500 attendees or registrants from around the globe, who just finished their breakfast or are about to sit down for lunch or dinner or may even be in bed, welcome. We are overwhelmed but gratified by your interest in Dan Hicks' book, The Brutish Museums, the timely story of the Benin bronzes that sit really at the heart of our heated debate about cultural restitution, reparation, and decolonizations in museums. There are attendees now from over 32 countries who join us today, many whose countries have felt the heavy boot of colonialism. Others here seek more information based on hard research, free of bias and omissions. Some of these countries include our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, others, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Europe contingent, India and Indonesia, and Africa, a continent that has suffered more from colonial rule. We especially welcome those from Nigeria, home to the Benin bronzes, and I want to especially welcome Prince Yemesi Shailan and his entire museum staff. This is truly a world audience addressing a global problem. To our national audience, including students from all over California, to those on the East Coast, we send special greetings to the Rhode Island School of Design, where the call for a return of the Benin head remains unsettled. And to our nearly 20 museums, from the Encyclopedia Met to the Fine Arts in San Francisco and LACMA here in Los Angeles, and to the regional and university museums, the Getty, the Phoebe Hearst, the Fowler, the Seattle Art Museum, and the New Orleans Museum, and our archaeology centers at Santa Cruz and UCLA, we welcome your presence. It is indeed a sophisticated and diverse group of people who have come together for our conversation today. You know, our program, which is a 2-hour version of the Benin Dialogue Group, but on a global platform, addresses the complex issues of cultural restitution, an often controversial debate that pits good people of goodwill who have an honest difference We won't resolve all the issues today, but our distinguished panel guarantees that we will view the problem from several different perspectives. Your attendance is evidence that the long road to restorative justice is filled with more people and raises hope that the journey's resolution will come sooner rather than later. You know, while the burden of colonialism is identified more with Europe, we in the United States have our own dark history to face. Seen as a renegade colony by Britain, we declared our independence in 1776, but retained much of the colonial values of the time. We too colonized, but on our home soil. You know, restitution is not a stranger to us. The land acknowledgement statement at the outset of the program speaks to our debt for the treatment of our own Native American people, the original inhabitants of our country. We have completed restitution payments, however inadequate, to our fellow Japanese Americans for the fundamental injustice of the evacuation, relocation, and internment during World War II. But our debt to our African American citizens after 400 years of slavery and embedded attitudes is still ongoing. The killing of George Floyd, the pandemic, and now the insurrection at our capital have shown us that the obstacles are there, and that unless we can bend the arc of history towards justice, it will take all of us. Surely, we really do want to thank Dan Hicks for writing his book, an idea that germinated 20 years ago and blossomed after the Roads Must Go demonstrations shattered the quietude of the Oxford campus. The fact that many African students found the Pitt River Museum as a place of violence triggered the writing of this important book, and we are all its beneficiaries. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dan Hicks, Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at Oxford, Curator at the Pitt River Museum, author of 9 books, and a scholar and activist. Dan?
Wonderful. Okay, thanks a million. I'm just going to perform the operation of sharing my screen. If someone could confirm they can see it when it's there, that would be great. Hopefully it's now showing.
Looks good, Dan.
Looks good, thank you. And so wonderful to be here. I've got half an hour or so to speak, and in that time, you know, I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about the writing of this book and a little bit about how the conversation here in Europe is developing. But, you know, importantly, it's an international conversation, and that's why it is so important that we, you know, have, you know, those here sort of in this conversation from other museums, because actually the question of how to reckon with, how to face up to African objects in Western museums is really a major challenge for our sector at the moment. And as we'll see, you know, it isn't a new idea. It's an idea, you know, which has been around for a little while. So the book is written very much from a certain location, and the positionality starts with my role as a curator at the Pitt Rivers, you know, over the past sort of 14 years. And so for those of you that can't visualize the museum, here it is. It's famed as a sort of survival of a Victorian you know, set of sort of displays. It was, you know, it has been here since 1884. It was built as an extra sort of gallery on the back of the Oxford Museum, which was a natural history museum. And that sense of the building of a cultural history museum as an extension of the Natural History Museum was at the heart of really what the Pitt Rivers was all about. And I think it sort of helps us understand actually what anthropology was about in the 1880s and 1890s. So in my role as a curator at the Pitt Rivers, of course, I mean, a lot of my work involves, ensuring that the museum to some degree stays the same. So the work of the curator is in part the work of a conservator. So ensuring that the textiles are not eaten by moths, that the metalwork isn't sort of rusting away. But sometimes, we curators have, if you like, undertaken a bit of, mission creep. We've come to misunderstand our role, inside the museum as one also of trying to stop the world around us from changing. And certainly that's happened at the Pitt Rivers over the years, to the point at which, as the book argues, we're suddenly seeing the museum in a new way because the museum, or the Colonial Museum, has failed. It's failed in these new times. And as the book argues, the failure of an object, of a thing, suddenly often means it can be seen. If we're on our way to work and the car won't start, suddenly the car is there in a way that it wasn't on any other normal morning. So it's the same for the museum. We're seeing the museum. We're having this conversation, around anthropology, around archaeology and heritage, because there's something about our regimes of display. There's something about our modes of visuality, which, are actually sort of not working in the way that they used to. So this museum was founded as a museum of what the man who made the initial collection, Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, called the evolution of a culture. And his ideas, which were common to anthropology in the late 19th century, are sort of nicely summed up in this image, which he drew, which is the sort of evolution of the wooden stick, but it's also, if you like, the evolution of weaponry. So in the middle, you've got a stick, which is sort of moving out over time, evolving to the right-hand side into being a shield. You've got the lances at the bottom, you've got the clubs at the top, your boomerangs on the left-hand side. So all of these objects are objects in the Pitt Rivers. At this point, he had them on display in London. And each of them was from Aboriginal Australia, all objects which he acquired in London. And arranging them in this, what he called hypothetical series, was in some ways simply a very simple Victorian narrative of improvement, that things, technologies evolve over time. But it was also fundamentally a statement of cultural supremacy and sort of superiority. So that idea that it isn't only nature that evolves, it's also cultures that evolve, meant, of course, that at the peak of that evolutionary process was, in his case, London or Oxford in the 19th century. So in this sort of display of objects, we see not only that idea, but its relationship to violence, because, the Pitt Rivers, as the book says, started as a museum of weapons and started with his work in the Royal Armouries in London, in the Rusey Museum, which is now a think tank, a military think tank, but in the 1870s, it actually had its own museum, which were filled with the weapons that over the previous sort of 200 years or so had been taken from the people that the British had fought around the world in order to build the British Empire. So this then, he expands it into other forms of object, into artworks and into other ethnological museums. But in all sorts of ways, the founding of the Ethnological Museum is in sort of weaponry and is in these evolutionary sort of thoughts. And that, here at the Pitt Rivers, came suddenly sort of back into view when the Roads Must Fall Oxford movement sent a social media message in October 2015. And they said the Pitt Rivers Museum is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford. And at that point, back in 2015, we were feeling, okay about ourselves as an institution. We'd undertaken restitution to First Nations in North America and to Maori communities and to Australia. We had hosted a potlatch, on the anthropology lawn for members of the Haida Nation who we'd funded to come and to copy some of the objects in the collections and to take the copies back to Vancouver. And we thought that in terms of working with source communities, actually we were doing an okay job. We had entirely missed what was being observed here, that the museum itself was hurtful in terms of the displays. And so the Roads Must Fall movement, as it had emerged in South Africa, earlier that year, which was around the image of Rhodes, the great or the not so great colonialist of the South Africa Company, whose image was at the heart of the campus, at the heart of the academy at UCT. That sort of protest had come from a generational shift. It was, apartheid had ended in 1994. Here we were in 2015, and students who were born, after the end of apartheid were continuing to experience racism. And these images, the cultural images that had been put to work to kind of naturalize those inequalities and to make them last, to make them endure in the form of artworks, were at the heart of the fight. So the removal of Rhodes from the center of the UCT campus was understood as a crucial part of the physical dismantling of the infrastructure of what we in our museum sector might call sort of white infrastructure, the infrastructure of a certain vision, a certain ideology of whiteness. So arriving in Oxford in the autumn of 2015, South African students, along with faculty and others, started not only to point to the image of Cecil Rhodes, which is here in Oxford outside Oriel College, but also across Oxford, seeing ways in which there were these time warps that made empire last, that where imperial thinking, colonial thinking had been physically built into the infrastructure of the academy. And so the Pitt Rivers was among those which were in the firing line. And, for us, when people are protesting at the front of your museum and are pointing out that every day you open your doors, and especially, it wasn't really the weapons they were talking about the Benin bronzes. When there are objects that were taken with violence that are on display, then every day you reopen your doors, you are reinscribing that violence. And if we are going to claim to represent the communities that we say we serve, then we really need to address that, not only for people that feel hurt when they come into the museum, but for those many people that would never even set foot in this museum because they know what it is. So the case of the Benin bronzes was at the heart of this conversation, of this dialogue, of the demands of the Roads Must Fall Oxford movement. But what is this event? And I mean, what are these objects? So here at the Pitt Rivers, we are responsible for 150 or so of the circa 10,000 objects which were looted, in this attack, in the 1890s. It was a so-called punitive expedition. It was framed, and the book goes into how this is very much a fake framing, but it was framed as a sort of punishment for an earlier wrong, in which not only more than sort of 10,000 objects were taken, but also vast numbers of people were killed. It was a large operation of corporate colonialism. It was a partnership in between the protectorate. So this isn't a colony. This is a protectorate, a kind of informal empire. And it turns out that looting in order to remove sovereignty and to put down traditional religion has a relationship with these sorts of informal empires. But also it's corporate. So the Royal Niger Company was the West African version of the South African Company. And Goldie, who is sort of less well known as a figure who sort of led that sort of company, was really West Africa's sort of version of Rhodes. So in this attack, it wasn't simply the removal of a kingdom, of a king who was part of a royal line that reaches back unbroken, earlier than Elizabeth I. But it was also, obviously the sort of a desecration of a sacred and a religious landscape, of the palaces which were around the city of the former obas, which had been allowed to fall into ruin as a way of turning them into mausoleums, in which altars were set up to remember certain obas, the name for the kings of Benin, and of the Queen Mothers and of other figures in the royal court. So this was also part, importantly, of a wider set of key moments that came after 1884, after the Berlin Congress, and what we euphemistically call the scramble for Africa, which makes it sound like this was only a fight in between different sorts of European nations. But of course, fundamentally was a period, as we know well, and it's been faced up to some degree in the case of the Congo for the Belgians, in terms of the Germans in Namibia, involved extreme levels of violence. Here in the UK, we're only starting to face up to actually what the British were doing after 1884, which is a date of the Berlin Congress. It is the date of the founding of the Pitt Rivers Museum, and it's also the date of the invention of the Maxim, which was the gun, which was so much at the heart of sort of how this violence was enacted. An extreme example in the machine gun and the testing of this technology on African bodies that would come onto the soil of Europe in the 20th century with such horror. This was a coming together of an extreme example of that evolution of the weapon that we saw in the Pitt Rivers sort of drawing earlier. So these objects involved most famously maybe the brass plaques which were taken from the pillars in the palaces, more than 1,200 of these objects which were cast in order, not only to represent but also to constitute ancestral history. And they're not only unique artworks and objects of devotion religiously, they're also a unique archive in this iconography of the history of the royal court. Alongside the plaques, which are often the focus of these conversations, as we see on the left-hand side in the BM in London, some of those on display. On the right-hand side, here is the case at the Pitt Rivers that reminds us that actually these objects that were taken were not only the plaques, but a host of other kinds of objects. So that includes the heads, as we see in the middle there, the brass heads of individual obas who are remembered, of the carved ivory tusks, with this again a unique iconography, as we see a detail on the right-hand side there, that tells the history of the royal court, and were put into the top of the heads in order to tell that oba's history. But also a whole host of other objects of ivory, of sort of brass, of coral work, that include the figurative work we see at the top, the hornblowers and the leopards, and of course the ivory sort of hip ornaments, the masks, an example of which we see in the bottom left-hand side. Here's a rare photograph from 1891 of one of those altars which were desecrated in this attack of 1897. So you can see the bells at the front and the figures of ancestral figures at the back, and then the two obas who are being remembered and venerated in this altar. So it's impossible to understate, I think, the significance of the act of desecration, which of course, I mean, the Hague Convention, as the book argues in 1899, in part was almost certainly a response to the sheer violence of the Benin Expedition. But, it's also, they are not sort of narratives that we're very familiar with, actually, when we tell the story in our museums. So maybe those that know the story are aware of this image on the right-hand side, which has been widely shared over the years on social media and in other publications. There's even a version of this in the National Museum in the Benin Ehikhamenor state. Which sort of shows the administrators and the soldiers sort of laying out the goods that they've just sort of pillaged in front of them for looting. But on the left-hand side, we're less familiar with this image, or this sort of image that shows the active sort of burning down of this vast sort of sacred royal landscape. So the removal of sovereignty goes hand in hand with the physical dismantling of the palace, and with the attempt to crush a religion, a traditional religion. So in the aftermath of this event, as the British formed Nigeria, and it's impossible to understate how much of an iconic and foundational moment for the British creation of Nigeria the Benin attack was. Over the years, with the reinstallation of the royal court under the British, the question of restitution came up. So one of the most important points I want to make to you today is that restitution is not something that someone just thought up, last year or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It's been a movement, and an African-led movement, in the same way as the fallism movement about the falling of colonial statues has been. It's an African-led movement that has existed for a long period of time. So here is an image of the first restitutions overseen by the British Museum of objects on loan to them in 1938. The return of 2 coral crowns and a coral robe to Oba Okenzo II. So this is here really to remind us of how long Nigeria, the royal court, have been asking for the return of these objects. Now, the book, I'm not going to go into all of the new terminology that the book introduces, but it sort of suffices to say that as an anthropologist, an art historian, an archaeologist, I found so many of the idioms, of the vocabularies, of the modes of thinking which I had available to me to try to tell this story entirely lacking. So for example, the normal idiom when we talk about objects or material culture, one of the most sort of common ones would be the idea of the life history of the object, whether it's in Arjuna Padarai's idea of the social life of things, or whether art history's account to focus on an object, moving between contexts, that sense that with each sort of new context, a new layer of meaning is added. But that additive, that positive account of these objects, these 10,000 objects, that were not looted, as I had been told always in the literature, in some coherent way, with some grim logic to sell off officially the loot to pay for a necessary expedition that had to punish, a rogue state. In fact, this was a chaotic free-for-all in which maybe 200 or so soldiers and administrators simply enriched themselves with what they could grab. And within weeks, some of these objects were on display in Oxford, London, Berlin. And then over the years, some continue to be in the families of the descendants of the men who took them. The art market has got involved in the 20th century over the years. But the idea of life history of objects, that seemed wrong. This wasn't a recontextualization, it was a loss. So the notion of the necrographic rather than the biographic, here in the book, I use Achille Mbembe's reframing of the Foucauldian notion of the biopolitical as the necropolitical. That sense that in the present day, with the border regimes of Europe, we need an account of the physical loss of life, that comes out of fortress Europe in its relationship to Africa and the Middle East. The loss of life in the Mediterranean needs a focus on that sort of aspect. Equally for objects and their journeys, we need to talk about histories of loss, histories of death. So the necrographic as a way of reframing the provenance research that we do, there's one example. The book also, it aims to reframe the 30-year period running up to 1914 from 1884 as a wider sort of campaign, a single campaign, which I call World War Zero. So the expedition is not just one incident, it's one of several other or many hundreds of other expeditions, that involved a lot of work on the military side, against Africans, in which untold millions of Africans were killed, which we need to face up to. And there's a wider European reckoning going on here. I talk about the chronopolitical, the sense in which, having attempted to destroy a kingdom, these objects were on display alongside Egyptian antiquities, alongside Assyrian reliefs, as if this kingdom were as old as ancient Egypt. It's in the past now. You've been rocket launched out of existence all the way back into the Bronze Age, and you're exhibited as if your culture is dead. And that chronopolitical, the politics of time, the accusation that this is an archaeological culture, is where the complicity of the museums starts to come into play. Because here in Oxford, after we beat the fascists in 1945, one of the first things that happened was, here in the museum, was the removal of the displays of human skulls that told the racist lie that there were different species of people. Right next door, in the Museum of Culture, we did not dismantle those displays that told precisely the same story with art, with culture, that told the story of the beating of the Oba, of a victory over Africa with these objects. And that's one of the challenges for us as curators today, because no matter how well we tell this story, how honestly we tell it, it's already being told in hundreds of museums around the world, because these objects have found their way around the world. So how do we face up to that in the present? Well, I think we can learn, and the book argues we can learn not only from the African-led movements of fallism and restitution, we can learn from the North American movements, not as we saw them only last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, but actually right the way back to Ferguson, and to Charlottesville. And my colleague Nick Nazof, in his important book, which you can read online, The Appearance of the BLM Movement, talks about the visual dimension of the Black Lives Matter sort of movement. He argues that sort of dashcam footage and cell phone footage suddenly made visible and shareable anti-Black violence that had been happening for centuries. And out of that visuality, a certain sort of politics, a set of possibilities actually came about. He uses Hannah Arendt's notion of the space of appearance in order to argue this case. What can we learn from that observation in our museums when we understand the Benin bronzes displays as memorials to anti-Black violence, as part of a white supremacist vision, which as anthropologists we left behind, a century ago, but is still time warped in every object, every one, as the book argues, of these 10,000 objects as representing an unfinished event. So it turns out that what some are calling the decolonization of museums, but which I prefer to see as an anti-colonial and a necessarily anti-colonial movement in museums, in that we're recognizing that racism has a relationship to empire and that museums have a relationship to empire. And therefore, there's anti-racist, if we're going to be anti-racist institutions, then we can't simply have a balance sheet approach to telling the good and bad sides of empire without, while failing to physically dismantle what I'm calling this sort of white infrastructure. So it turns out that that work, though, that anti-colonial work, starts with the very traditional work of the curator. It starts with us making visible what we have, where it is. So there's a first attempt at the back of the book to list the institutions, and some of the institutions is absolutely wonderfully are here in this conversation today, because these objects, the 161 institutions at my first count, this is very much a provisional list of where these objects have got to. Some of them reach as far as sort of California. They have gone from St. Petersburg to Abu Dhabi to Australia and so on. Yeah, let's make these objects visible. Let's show where they are. Let's allow the African claims for restitution not simply to be a nation-to-nation conversation in between the formerly colonized nation and the formerly colonizing nation, but let's open it up in this different way to a conversation where, for the North American audience here, crucially, where there are museums out there, in New York, for example, who have argued that they acquired an object legally, they purchased it at an auction, therefore it can't be stolen. Well, to those institutions, one has to ask, how many times does an object looted with such violence from an African nation, how many times does it have to pass hands in between white curators and the art market and dealers until it's no longer a stolen object? I would argue that there isn't a number there, that it always is a stolen object, and that the regimes of display that we inherit from anthropology are going to continue to tell that history of violence. Ultimately, this book is a defense of the project of the World Culture Museum. I want to work in a World Culture Museum which is fit for the 21st century, which is in step with our times. That means, exactly like any other way of tackling institutional racism, we need to tackle, as with Confederate statues, so indoors in our museums, for a period of time in between the 1880s and the 1920s or 30s, white supremacy sought to build itself into the fabric of culture. It's very hard to pull down a statue. It's very hard to change a display. And these people knew that. And these ideologies used our museums. They co-opted us for a period of time. And that's why it was easier for the scientists to recognize that race science, as it was called, was ultimately bad science. It's much harder for those of us in the cultural sector, cultural anthropology, in archaeology, art history, curators. We think of ourselves as much more aware of race, but somehow we have failed to address. In a North American context, you've led the world on restitution to First Nations. There's so much more to do. There's so much more to do on that topic in terms of land rights and the connections between stolen land, stolen ancestors, stolen art. But how is it that the conversation about African restitution hasn't even begun? So I hope with this book, it will. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. Please, everyone, imagine a rousing set of applause from across time zones around the globe. Everyone, stand up at home, applaud, stretch your legs. We're going to transition now to a panel discussion. I'm Lauren Croys. I'm the faculty director at the Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. I'm also an associate professor in the History of Art department, where I study US modernism. I am not an expert in the arts of Africa, and I've only been a museum director for a year. So I'm extremely grateful to be joined on this panel by my very expert colleagues. They'll each speak for about 5 minutes. We'll introduce ourselves in relationship to the issues Dan raises, and then we'll have some additional discussion. First, we'll have artist, writer, and trustee of the Legacy Restoration Trust in Nigeria, Victor Ehikhamenor, then Natasha Becker, the new curator of African art at the De Young Museum in San Francisco, California. We're so happy to have her in the Bay Area. And she'll be followed by a couple words by me, and then Marla Berns, the Shirley and Ralph Shapiro, director of the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Dan will also join us on the panel. So please applaud from home for our illustrious panel, and I'll turn it over now to Victor.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate it. Again, my name is Victor Ehikhamenor. I'm from Edo State, which is where the Benin Kingdom is situated. You know, to a lot of people, is Benin Kingdom, which was heavily looted, which Professor Dan has spoken so much about in his new book, The Brutish Museum. You know, I can't say how timely this book has been, because not only has it woken up a lot of the historical aspect of this human carnage, because we are quick to always turn to call the things that were taken from the kingdom in 1897 objects. And we tend to forget that there was a lot of human destruction that happened. There was the testing of the new machine guns by the British soldiers, and if we want to like draw a little bit of comparison, you can compare that to what the world will later known as the A-bomb, because I mean that was the most sophisticated weapon then. Even though there were rules of engagement on how they were going to be used, but because the British soldiers found themselves in this kingdom, there were no rules in this war. So there was a lot of what you could call war crime against humanity, just to start from there. Because we are talking about art, we are talking about objects, sometimes we forget that a lot of people lost their lives, and an entire city was burned down within few days without any regards for humanity or respect for the culture, you know. So we are back now, 120 something years later. Since then, we are talking about the return of faith, and like Dan rightly said, this is not the first time we are asking for these things. This is not the first time our you know, past rulers or past kings or past royalties or past government have asked for it. You know, like he rightly said, in 1936, there was a request for some of these things to be returned. What are termed objects or what are termed artifacts. But we also are not acknowledging the fact that these are not just objects, these are not just arts, these are not just artifacts, because for the Benin Kingdom, it has never been art for art's sake, really. Yes, we have a few things that are, you could say, are decorative, but a lot of the things that were taken, that were stolen, that were looted in that bloody war are things that are very representative. You know, they are things that, they are objects that we have written history on. They are plaques that could serve as our writing system, our ways of telling our things that are recorded, you know. So it's like going to the Buckingham Palace and burning down the entire archive, or taking things that you will use for coronation of a new queen or a new king, you know. So then you turn around when you ask for these things years later, people that don't really understand the importance of these things begin to question, why do you need them? We need them in these museums elsewhere, whereby we can reference them, we can learn about the culture. And you are forgetting the fact that when you are learning about the people's culture, what about those that came later into that culture? How are they supposed to learn about that culture? You have a total disregard for those that came after the looting, after the stealing of these things, as if they had never had any use for it. So that sense of post-colonialism seems to always throw me off as a way of still showing off that we can steal these things, we can hold on to these things for as long as we want to. So we have always asked for them. Nigeria has always asked for some of these things. In 1976/77, during the Festac, there was a request for the Idia mask, which is sitting pretty in the British Museum today, for this big festival that was about to happen. And there was foot dragging from the British government, from the British Museum, to the extent that they were requesting that there should be an insurance for the piece for about £2 million as at then. You know, so then we are back again now to 2020s, and we are still talking about these items or these arts or these archives. We are talking about those that want to even give them back. They are talking about loaning it back to us, you know, which I find quite ridiculous sometimes when those conversations come up. The other issue is that most maybe Western journalists will ask when they are talking about this is, where exactly are they going to keep this thing? And they don't realize how condescending that can be, because they are speaking from an object, from a position of, oh, African is one big village, or places where these things were stolen for are no longer in existence, or they don't have any use for what has been taken from them violently, you know. So to quickly come to that and answer some of those things, I'm a little bit hesitant to call them museum, because I don't want to fall into that Western construction of how we should see things, or how things should be displayed, or how things should be used. You know, so in Benin, we are in the process of building a place where these things can come back to, which is the Udomi Museum of West African Art, which is going to be designed by the renowned architect David Adjei, and working with the Legacy Restoration, Trust, so that we can now begin to answer those questions when this institution is built, when this place where the things that are going to be returned are completely built. So at the moment, there are motions, there are things, there are arrangements for whatever is being returned, how they are going to be received, how they are going to be stored, how they are going to be protected. Those things and those programs are getting in place as we speak in Benin City. And luckily enough, right now we have a governor, Governor Godwin Obaseki, who is in full support of having this issue of restitution on the front burner of his administration. So I'll let the other panelists speak about it, and when other questions come up later, we can discuss them. Thank you.
So we're going to turn it over to Natasha now. So Natasha, if you want to go ahead and turn your video and audio on, and I'll share the screen on your behalf.
Thank you, Katie. And hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Feely Lee and the Ethnic Arts Council of Los Angeles for bringing us together and organizing this panel. I, for one, am happy to be here, and I'm very excited that the vision to establish a new Royal Museum to reunite in Benin City the most significant of Benin's historical artworks is becoming a reality. I joined the De Young Museum in December as the inaugural Curator of African Art, where I'm responsible for a collection of around 300 key historical artworks and for engaging with modern and contemporary African art also. Thank you, Dan, for an excellent presentation of your work. I'm going to begin my remarks with a quick show and tell from the African art collection at the De Young Museum in San Francisco, and I'll conclude with a few questions for the discussion. So in this first slide, you will see that the De Young has two fragments of the treasures that were stolen from the royal court in Benin by the British in the 19th century. The bronze plaque on the left was purchased by the museum in 1980 and the bronze ornament in 1975. I'll just focus for a minute on the ornament because we know a little bit more about it. It was purchased from the Alexander Suggs Gallery of African Art that was based in St. Louis and New York between 1970 and 1989. The gallery's clients included major museums like the Met Museum, the Yale University Art Gallery, the St. Louis Art Museum, for instance. Donald M. Suggs was an African-American born in East Chicago, and he became a successful private oral surgeon and launched the gallery partnership in 1970. He later founded and chaired the African Continuum to support non-commercial African-American art endeavors. But he was also a founding member of what would become the Museum of African Art in New York. And I find it really fascinating that the ornament tells the story of violence and dissociation legitimated by imperialism, and as Dan has eloquently laid out in his book, but simultaneously opens up another story about the collecting of African art in the United States. And I'm sure we'll return to this in our discussion. During my research, I also discovered this wonderful album imprint photograph of a display of Benin objects in the British Museum in our Achenbach Foundation of Graphic Arts collection. And I have a really deep and abiding interest in the way photography was rooted in imperial formations of power. So I would love to hear Dan's discoveries in the archives of Pitt Rivers and his thoughts on the impact of photography and its potential today. We can move to slide 2. Here we see the bronze plaque and the ornament displayed in the African art galleries at the De Young. Now the galleries, like the museum, has been closed for the better part of the year. And one of the priorities that we identified when I was appointed was to really take on our objects and to explore that. The museum had already in February of 2021, last year, held a public symposium that was organized by Christine Halmich, who is the head of Africa, Oceania and the Americas at the De Young. And it was organized with Constantine Petridis, who is the chair of Arts of Africa and the Americas at the Chicago Art Institute. Christine and Constantine had also invited to the discussion Mdubusi Heiselumba, who is the Francois Billion Richardson Curator of African Art in New Orleans Museum of Art, and Professor Barbara Plankensteiner of the Benin Dialogue Group to the De Young for the public conversation. And the goal of this was to participate in an open conversation with the Benin Dialogue Group, obviously, but also to educate the museum's various stakeholders about and to create greater understanding about the objects in the collection and the museum's participation in the conversation. So the museum's two small Benin objects may seem insignificant when compared to the hundreds that are held at the British Museum, but to us they offer an extraordinary opportunity to unlearn imperial modes of thinking, to undo imperial practices, and to bring everyone along with us on that journey in a context where there's still so much misunderstanding and misrecognition of African art history, and culture. So I embrace these opportunities and the challenges of openly investigating our collection history through research, education, and engagement with stakeholders about restitution. I'm excited to do this work and to share the outcomes in the future. I'll sum up my quick introduction with some questions. As you may hear from my accent, I am South African, and I have first-hand knowledge and experience of British imperialism and its ongoing impact in my country and across the continent. But part of my curatorial practice is also informed by curating and caring, as well as emancipatory practices in the work that artists are doing in terms of dealing with generational trauma. And so it's important to also say that we are not only on the one side of the violent experience, but we're also on the other side of emancipation and healing. And your book, as you said, Dan, coincided with this larger movement for decolonization that started with Rhodes Must Fall in Cape Town and continued to Oxford. And I just would like to hear your opinion on the public climate in Britain and whether it is truly favorable to the kind of reckoning with imperial violence that you have suggested. The British Museum's position, as Victor mentioned just earlier, also seems to be one of collaboration and partnership over returning actual objects. Can you say more about the institution's internal Africa program and how that shaped the museum's position? And then finally, I'll just end with saying that as a curator and a scholar too, I am incredibly curious to know how your research and scholarship over the past 10 years informed and impacted the day-to-day curatorial work as well as your teaching. So I will end there. Thank you. And I hand the microphone back to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Natasha. So hello again. Reminder, I'm Lauren Croys from the Hearst Museum, where we started planning this event last summer when Dan tweeted, Katie, can you share the slides? Thank you, Katie. When Dan tweeted that the two bells you see on the left were likely looted from Benin in 1897. You can see, hopefully, the web address for our online public catalog at the bottom of my slide if you too would like to search our collections. I am embarrassed to say that I'd looked at these photographs before and thought something along the lines of, oh, those don't really look good enough to be looted, which is an absurd response and one that Dan's book helped me realize it really comes from that brutal process of fragmentation under colonialism. These bells, it's true, don't look quite like the famous lustrous looted metal plaques and heads, but I can also now see that these bells are part of a sacred landscape. They're part of altars in Benin, and they're also part of landscapes of altar violence that spread over the globe under colonialism and in its aftermath. These bells also have a long story that we could discuss more. When I was looking for images today, I also noticed the lion that you see on the right, and I'm an art historian, so I can't not show you lots of images. I searched for our catalog for Benin 19th century, and this lion turned up along with a digitized catalog card, which you see here below. And that's documentation that's online for almost all the catalog numbers in the Hearst Museum's collection. On that card, I read that the lion was from the Republic of Benin, not Benin City, and it was donated after being purchased by a British dealer who appears in Dan's book. So none of these works are on display right now. The Hearst Museum has a vast global collection, but it has one very, very small gallery, and we have a lot of what Dan would call necrography ahead. I show these images here to help us think about the global reaches of empire and its violence, about the way that, as Dan puts it, colonial histories need to be not so much reversed as dug into. I want to close with the next slide, which is some pie charts. I am inspired by pie charts that I saw from the Pitt Rivers Museum, in which collections percentages seem to sort of trace the violence and extraction of the British Empire. Reading the Brutish Museums in California and at the Hearst Museum, I think has helped us to consider how our own institutions' specific investments in specific and ongoing kinds of colonial violence. So as you see here, I made these pie charts with help from one of our staff members, Michael, thank you. About 6.8% of the Hearst collections originate in Africa. That's over 44,000 catalog numbers. We hold the largest Egyptian collection on the West Coast. In addition, we hold collections from across the African continent that include media, archaeology, and over 10,000 ethnographic objects, including 8 from Benin City. However, you can see that 46% of the Hearst Museum's collections originate in California. At Berkeley, we're often proud to be the first UC campus, but with our founding in 1868, we also inherit a legacy of tremendous violence against California's indigenous people. Even before the Hearst existed as a museum, our collections began with projects that participated in and were made possible by campaigns of genocide waged against Native Californian people. Ancestors whose descendants are still here, alive and thriving with us today. We don't yet see the mission system, the gold rush, or the termination era as a spectacular moment of ultraviolence like the looting of Benin, and perhaps we never will. Still, I'm so grateful to Dan's book for a language to think with the ways colonial violence, even what we might call a slow violence, isn't a past act, but an ongoing event. Much in our current institutions depends on anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence and dispossession, but Dan convinces me to hold on to hope that museums could also create more just worlds through repatriation, restitution, and repair. Thank you. Now I'll turn it over to my UCLA colleague, Marla Berns.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to join my esteemed colleagues on this panel. And I want to also thank Dan for writing the book that sort of got this whole thing going. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Fowler Museum, where I have been director for nearly 20 years. I think it's important to look to the beginning and think about where we started. And in the case of the Fowler, we're much younger than all the other museums represented here today. We were founded in 1963 by a visionary chancellor named Franklin Murphy. And you see him here in this famous photograph by Ansel Adams. He decided that it was important that UCLA have a new museum, and a new museum that would be non-Western in its focus. He called it the Museum and Laboratory of Ethnic Art and Technology. And from the outset, it was intended to be interdisciplinary and global, encompassing art and material culture from Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Indigenous Americas. One of only a handful of university museums in this country with this kind of purview, including the Phoebe Hearst. And I think that the photo or the portrait I'm showing you gives you a little hint at Murphy's own personal collecting interests and why, in part, he decided to create this rather original institution. The next great thing that Chancellor Murphy did for UCLA was to negotiate in 1964 the donation of over 30,000 objects from the Wellcome Trust in London. The Wellcome Trust is the custodian of a vast global collection of over 1 million items amassed by the pharmaceutical industrialist Sir Henry Wellcome during the colonial period. Not having built the museum he wished during his lifetime, the Wellcome Trust was responsible for these collections and started to distribute them in a series of dispersals, including an important one to the Pitt Rivers, and then to the Fowler Museum some 20 years later, where they arrived in 1965 to a museum only 2 years old. This auspicious start, I think, starts to set the course of this institution's history and has shaped our work as a laboratory for research and innovation and as a museum of art and cultural history. Next slide, please. In 2018, we received a major grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to do focused research on the African objects in our Wellcome collection for the first time in the museum's history. At the heart of this project, now in its 3rd year, is the goal of better understanding what we have in the collection and excavating what we can of the histories and journeys of objects from their source communities into the Wellcome collection, which has also included learning more about the object's uses, meanings, and materials. The collaborative interdisciplinary research initiative we proposed to the Mellon brings together the methodologies of archival, ethnographic, and scientific analysis. The chance for a small museum like ours to hire 2 full-time Mellon Fellows, Carly Forbes in curatorial, and Marcy Burton in conservation, and to direct at least 50% of the time of our curator of African arts, Erica Jones, to this project has been transformational for the Fowler in facilitating the collaborative process of recovering and reconstructing knowledge about a subset of our Wellcome holdings and engaging in conversations about their future disposition, including the identification of candidates for restitution. This has included investigating about 18 objects of Benin royal regalia, 2 of which you see on the screen, such as the brass pendant plaque on the left worn at the waist by an Oba on special occasions, and the object on the right, a brass tableau originally displayed on an ancestral altar dedicated to the Queen Mother, the mother of the Oba. In both these cases, important archival research done by the team uncovered the journeys of loss that took both objects to Britain and saw them put up for auction by the British officers who stole them, and then they were purchased for the Wellcome collection before they were then donated many years later to the Fowler Museum. Next slide. Acknowledging the serendipity that plays into this work, we discovered this photograph that had been found by a Brit named Ben Hall at a flea market in Brighton. He was so intrigued by the contents of the photo that he began his own search to understand what we're looking at in George Neville's House of Treasures, as he called it, including our Fowler altar, which you see on the hearth, and many other objects in the photos, some of which reside today in museums like MoMA, the Musée de Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, and the National Museum in Lagos. Mr. Neville brought out of, or stole, I should say more clearly, from Benin, at least 128 objects. Next slide, please. During an inventory of our collection at the early stage of this project, Erica Jones was intrigued by a trove of objects Sir Henry Wellcome purchased directly out of the Nigeria Pavilion at the British Empire Exhibition in London between 1924 and 1925. The objects instigated particular archival research that led Erica to organize for us a small exhibition that we showed in 2019 called On Display in the Walled City, the Nigeria Pavilion at the British Empire Exhibition. It featured elements of a wood model of a Benin altar, which you see installed in the slide, along with other works of art created by artists brought to London from Nigeria to themselves be on display as they carved work for people at the exposition to watch. The particular ensemble of Benin objects you see here was based on the actual commemorative altar commissioned in 1921 by Oba Ovaramwen's son, Eweka II, after his father's death in exile in 1914. And Oba Ovaramwen was the Oba who was deposed at the time of the 1897 expedition. This altar, created in 1921, burned in 1923, making this replica an important piece of the historical record. The bitter irony cannot be lost on us that the British commissioned Royal Guild artists in Benin to carve a wood replica of an altar, and that the one they copied was meant to honor the deposed Oba Ovaramwen, and was then destined for display in the Nigeria Pavilion's lounge. Next slide, please. In a 1924 report by Major C.T. Lawrence, who was the exhibition commissioner for Nigeria, he wrote this statement: The whole of the carving, which was sent from Benin, has been colored in England and set out as in the original at Benin. The imitation ivory is quite extraordinarily good, and the whole replica quite effective. I think I end with this because it reminds us that the stories of colonial theft continue to be recovered and will be as long into the future as our research can continue. And this is the intent of the Fowler Museum around its Mellon funding and its Mellon project. So I'm the last speaker on this presentation of our institutions and what we're doing around the issues that Dan has brought up in his book. And I think I would just say that Natasha began by asking you, Dan, a number of questions, and hopefully you jotted them down, or else I'm sure Natasha can repeat them. And maybe we can start with the questions that she brought up for you.
I'd like to invite all of our panelists to turn on their video and audio now so that we can all be in conversation with one another. And I'll turn it back to you, Dan. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks so much. Yes, I did. I certainly took notes from everybody. And so let me try to answer some of those. But actually, first, I have to say what a wonderful range of responses. And so, you know, it's really great to feel that as a sector, you know, one of the things the book seeks to achieve, you know, is to show that this is a conversation that we can have, you know, if you like, as a part of our jobs. In the past, the restitution conversation has been, you know, polarized, and some institutions have actively wanted that actually, you know, to be the case, hoping it will just sort of disappear. So, you know, I think it's amazingly important that we correct ourselves, as we just heard, that these things weren't taken, they were stolen, you know, and that we are open to sharing information of what's in the collections, but also, you know, listening to, amplifying and acting on those who are asking for you know, returns. So Natasha asked about the situation in the UK. You know, and I could talk about that all night, because we are finding ourselves at a position where the cultural war that some on the right wish to start is sort of getting a lot of airtime. But I think I'm actually very optimistic about where we are in the UK and actually where we are across Europe. So it's only 2 years since the Macron report, the Sarr-Savoy report, and already we're seeing objects that were listed in that report that are being returned to Madagascar, to Senegal, Benin. We're seeing the Germans actively involving, obviously, with their federal system. Across the 16 states, you're seeing restitution, you know, really on the agenda and being acted on. You've got the Netherlands, who've announced, you know, only last week or the week before, their desire to return objects. Among the Belgians, you've got a major commission into the legacies of empire. So really here in the UK, and of course, I mean, there's a whole Irish conversation. There's a piece in The Guardian only yesterday by the President of Ireland, who again was sort of talking about a reckoning with empire. So I think in the UK, there's also a generational shift among the curators, you know, of which, I mean, maybe I'm a part of that, whereby it's just normal. But for so long, it's been normal for us, you know, to restitute in the case of Holocaust spoil, to restitute in the case of ancestral remains. You know, and a lot of these arguments that we hear now against cultural restitution were the same arguments that were used in the 80s and 90s. You know, oh, sort of what happened? You know, how are you going to make sure you give it back to the right people? You know, what if you give this thing back if it's sold? Or what if it's not on display in a museum? But, if you return Holocaust loot to the descendants and the rightful owners, then it's their object. They can do what they want with it. If you return an ancestral skull, in the case of First Nations, we don't expect, that group, to build a racist museum and to put it on display, right? I mean, normally these objects are destroyed, because of course they are people, they're ancestors. So in the case of cultural remains, which, as we've heard, and I think Victor really underlined this, that they don't just represent ancestors, they constitute ancestors. That division that we in the curatorial world often make between unmodified human remains, as we call them, and sort of cultural remains, actually that distinction's very problematic for many African communities and nations. So I think there's a generational change happening in our curators, but I think our audiences and our wider society is changing as well. The events of last year were not exactly as in the US. I mean, it isn't that they came out of nowhere. For us in the cultural sector, it was the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 and the Macpherson report in 1999 that called for institutional racism to be addressed. And it's our sector that have failed in the intervening 20 years to see the progress that we needed. It's interesting how, there was progress in the late 90s on the Benin bronzes, on all sorts of questions around racism, slavery, and so on. And somehow, with the Declaration of Universal Museums, with a whole host of things that happened in the early 2000s, we sort of lost our momentum. Colston, actually wasn't toppled at the time through the public consultation process that it should have happened then. I attended an event to remove Edward Colston from Bristol in 1998. So it took a generation, and actually my generation failed to see him removed through public consultation. But now we're at a point, let's hope, in the case of Cecil Rhodes, where it isn't just that a democratic decision has been made at the college level, but that the community has been asked. And the community, I'd be very surprised if when the report is sort of written, the answer is not that actually, this is what the city, this is what the university, those involved in it want. So all of this is about sort of putting people at the heart of our practice. In so many other parts of what we do in museums, we talk about communities, we talk about stakeholders, but we haven't yet gone the next step, which is to care for people more than we care for things, and to put them absolutely at the heart of our practice. So that means, I really do want to work in a museum where if there is a demand for a return of an object, that we're able to take action on a case-by-case basis. So this is not just about sharing the knowledge, taking a long time over excavating our archives. Simultaneously, as we share that knowledge, we need to listen to and amplify the demands, and we need to take action on them. We need to allow ourselves to dismantle what we're doing. So I do think in the UK, we're in a place actually where that's sort of likely to happen. There will be a new Arts Council England guidance on restitution. Here at the University of Oxford, we have a new procedure for handling the claims for the return of cultural remains. In the moral economy of all this, though, I do just want to go to Marla's point, which was about welcome. And I think there are two things about welcome, because we also have welcome objects here at the Pitt Rivers. And I think welcome reminds us of two things, which are really important in this conversation. First, welcome or Pitt Rivers or Crowber Hall are ways of, memorializing dead white men in very distinctive ways, as if they were a statue. So those institutional histories that are represented in these objects are very much sort of built into, what one way of how we can tell the past, or we can use those objects and those sort of legacies in different ways. It will involve some dismantling. And for the welcome objects in your care, it sounds like the Benin, objects are a part of what needs to be dismantled. But, it doesn't mean that you're attacking the institution if you do that, exactly with the renaming of something or the removal of a memorial. But it reminds us of a second, even more important point, I think, which is these museums were not forever. We often talk as if the curatorial work, almost the curators and the looters are kind of together with the colonial administrators, the excavators, all the people that brought things from Africa. All of them were engaged in the Universal Museum project right from the day, the get-go, right? They were saving things that otherwise wouldn't survive. And yet you look at the history of these institutions, at the selling off of the second collection of Pitt Rivers, at the mess of the Wellcome collection over the years, the fact that there isn't even a catalogue of what they hold in London at the moment, the fact that there are so many museums, as the book mentions, that have shut down, things have been sold off, and even the museums that are there in the regions in the UK, less than 1% of African objects that were taken under colonialism are on display. We don't know what's in the stores. We haven't done this work. And a final point, I think, why haven't we done this work? A big part of it is that the white infrastructure of our institutions is interlinked with the sheer whiteness of who we are. We don't look like the communities that we claim to represent. So here at the Pitt Rivers, the work that we're doing goes hand in hand with the positive action studentships for Black and minority ethnic, applicants at master's level, at doctoral level, which under the Equalities Act we can take, but also under our public sector equality duty, we are bound to address, so that we start sort of investing in these collections. We have expertise. I think there is obviously a connection in between the sheer whiteness of our museums and the fact we've invested so much in European art institutions and not in the museums that hold African and Asian art and art from the global south. So I imagine that's enough from me for now, but all sorts of thoughts inspired by what everyone said. So thank you.
Natasha.
Thank you. And I want to come back to something that you were saying then around people, and that Victor was also speaking about the relationship between people and objects. And in this particular case, the Benin objects, but also to kind of collapse a little bit this dichotomy between Benin as out there in Nigeria, in Africa, Benin City, and, Oxford in London and in the UK, because we know that, the contemporary in which we live sees, the reality is that we have these, colonies, former colonies and former colonial subjects inhabit the same physical space, cultural space, geographic, etc. So there are, incredibly large Nigerian communities in the UK as well as in the United States, and that's just to stick with this topic and subject. And so, I think that I've been reading a lot of the work around photography, as I mentioned earlier, by Ariella Aisha Azule. And I think she makes such a compelling argument for, between people and objects and photographs and archival material, etc. In that, this is also a conversation about the rights of people to live near their objects, whether that is in Africa or in the UK, for instance. And so can you maybe elaborate a little bit more around, this interconnection that exists? And also, the conservative right and this culture war that, you mentioned, one can sort of see, the potential of, the potential way in which returning cultural artifacts to Africa can also be an argument for returning African people to Africa. And in the sense of immigration today and xenophobia and the problems around immigrants from Africa in Europe.
Okay, I mean, it may be that, that Victor wants also to say something on that question, but yeah, let me have a first go. So I think, I mean, the Universal Museum argument, which addressed these questions a generation ago, and were bound up with a certain sort of curatorial model, which was the sort of Neil McGregor History of the World in 100 Objects model, which is the very opposite of a human-centered or a community-centered approach. It was about the lone, white curator, male curator, who had all the answers, who told the stories. In all the other parts of our practice, we've moved, I think we're all agreed, over the past sort of 20 years to a different model of museums. But that Universal Museums model was also fundamentally about the idea that, well, if West Africans want to see their heritage, they just need to get on an aeroplane and come to New York or London. But the changing visa regimes for Africans were already making that a fairly unlikely, process. And then lockdown and this moment we find ourselves in now, if we understand this not as a dress rehearsal for environmental sort of change, but as the start of environmental change in terms of how it addresses, the sheer scale of international movement for leisure or for culture, then it means we have to call into question the hyper concentration of culture in the global north in these centers, which are absolutely an ongoing artifact of the dispossession of Africa under colonialism. So the idea, the sheer power which again, Victor is the person to talk about this, the sheer significance, though, for all parts of culture, for creativity, for art, for filmmaking, for fashion in Edo State for these objects cannot be underestimated, especially when 800 of the 900 objects in the British Museum are not on display. We don't even know a full exact number of what's in the British Museum. We know only 8% of these objects are in the British Museum. 92% of them are around the world. Now, to transfer ownership to, Nigeria, the Royal Court, and simply to sign the paper, and for objects then to be recalled as and when, is one really interesting option here. This isn't necessarily about fetishizing, the physical movement of objects. It's about agency. It's about us Europeans, like me, removing ourselves from the decision-making process about the fate of these objects. We can sign over ownership, and then actually the Royal Court, the Nigerian nation can, make its sort of decisions over where these objects should be. I do think that, though, that fundamentally, final point, and then I'll hand over to Victor, that why is it that when is the argument over the chronopolitical, why is it that when we see African art in our museums in Britain, it's always 500 years old or 400 years old, or ancient Egypt? Where is contemporary African art in our galleries? So actually, I think, what many in the Nigerian diaspora and the African diaspora here in the UK would love to see is for contemporary art galleries to have as many African artists. I mean, so much, not only is the model of the museum being actually reinvented in a whole host of incredibly exciting ways, from Africa, but also contemporary art. So many, and we have one here, so many of our contemporary, of the best international contemporary artists are African artists. So that's what I hope that answers sort of some of how that looks from where I'm sitting. But I'll hand over to Victor.
Thank you, Dan. I think you took the question out of my mouth. Like, you remember in our first conversation, I asked how many of the museum's directors and museum curators that were present that day as they are today as well. how large is your contemporary or even modern, modern African collection? Because that fixation, that gaze, that holding on to these works that are classic, what I call classic African art, there seems to be such a fixation about it. There is so like, oh, this is ours, and there is a tendency not to realize that that is problematic, in the sense that you are holding on to a certain legacy, right? That also brings to mind, like you're saying, after the looting, after colonialism, Africans stopped creating. Okay, so you go to some of these, you go to some of these museums, you see this classic African work, then you jump to Picasso's, Matisse, right? Because a lot of them borrowed from this, our mark making, our masks, and they inspire them, they influence them. But there is that cross-referencing for the Western pantheons, okay? Then you are looking at like, okay, fine, but where are the Africans, are the African artists that created works that generated, that are the offsprings of this old classic artists? There's a huge gap there. There's a huge gap there in curatorial studies. There's a huge gap there in curatorial arrangements. There's a huge gap there in the way museums of the West are constructed. And of course, I'm not saying that we have to like beg Western museums to like display our works, but if you are going to hold tight to these things that have issues with the way they were stolen, then I think there is something wrong somewhere. If you look at your collection and there is a stoppage after, say, 1897, okay? After a lot of these countries gained their independence, suddenly, all right, we are done. We are going back home. Nigeria, you have gained your independence in 1960. Peace out. We are going back, and anything that happened after 1960, because we are not there to supervise it, because we are not there to like loot them, they don't exist. We are not going to respect them. Okay, so if you also even look at the African Americans, because it's now, after the Black Lives Matter, that's when you are seeing the resurgence right now. And everybody is suddenly like scrambling right now. You look at these great artists that have lived among you people, right, that are in the West, the museum trustees, the museum directors. You have these great artists that have lived among you, but none whatsoever. When you look at your collection, suddenly you realize that there is this gaping hole, and everybody is scrambling right now. And again, yeah, so to be totally honest with you, I think there's a lot of dishonesty in the way the works that comes out from Africa are being collected or are being displayed or are even being referenced, So again, I'll hand over back to either Dan or somebody that wants to speak in that regard.
I'd just like to say, Victor, in response to what you're saying, and also Dan, that in fact, in the US, there is a large number of museums that are doing contemporary art. And I would also say to you that one of the reasons we received the Mellon grant that we did was because the Mellon Foundation was worried that nobody cared at all about the historical collections from Africa, because there is such a great interest by students coming through art history and other disciplines to study contemporary African art and to understand the restorative justice issues around bringing those artists into our galleries, to having them speak directly to our audiences about their own experiences. And the Fowler has felt very good about the fact that when it brings in contemporary artists, it also has a very strong sense of the legacies of their own histories and where they've come from, not from a personal point of view, but surely from a cultural one. So I do think that a lot of our institutions are doing a good job. We can always do a better job. Bringing in African artists and bringing in the voices of communities that surround us to also, have these partnerships and make these relationships between African Americans in our own cities, African artists who come to see us, and our audiences that are hungry for this kind of exposure to contemporary African voices. But I want to also make one point that takes us a little bit backwards and just say that I'm not going to say it's easy, but there's a big difference between the ability to frame restitution plans around objects that were so obviously plundered and that have been associated with acts of war, as you describe in your book, Dan. But a lot of us, including the many hundreds of objects we have in the Wellcome collection, do not come from those circumstances. They come from small communities, they come from villages, they come from places that people traveled, and it's very difficult to reconstruct those journeys, those stories, those communities to whom we need to speak in order to actually consider what to do next. And I would say that worries me more than the capacity to consider how we might actually talk about repatriating our things from Benin, our things from Kumasi that were stolen by, et cetera. So what do you think about that? How can we open the conversation to the really tough work of all those objects that were equally important as cultural patrimony, as are the Benin bronzes to the Edo people?
Yes, absolutely. And so I'm going to attempt to answer that while also managing to answer the part of Natasha's question, which I haven't answered yet, which was about the photographic, and also that thing about how, what was the work I did sort of before getting to sort of writing this book in terms of the curatorial work, because I think they're all linked in certain ways. So obviously, in terms of the media spin on this, the old idea that to talk about restitution is to empty the galleries, everything, send everything back. Of course, sometimes that sounds, as Ariella has observed, and Ariella and I are actually in conversation about the two books at an event, I think next month. But this is, for me, it's about giving back rather than sending back. And what I mean by that is it's about responding to demands on a case-by-case basis, but also sharing knowledge so those demands can be made. I think that's what being a curator that's what I intend to do with the rest of my working life at the Pitt Rivers. That's the work I think that someone like me should be doing. I don't think there's much else that because this is the Euro pessimism that I talk about in the preface. The idea that actually in the past, sort of curators have thought their job is to get into the detail of understanding what these objects meant, what their significance for ways of thinking and sort of being. And for me, for these objects which are demanded or will be demanded if their existence is known about, actually that secondary historicity, the history of taking, and of course, not only in violent ways, and not only in military expeditions, but through archaeological excavation, through ethnographic, acquisition, natural history collecting, a whole host of, even purchase, which importantly in the Savoir report, they introduced the idea of consent, which really shocked some people in the French world to introduce that sort of language. But in many ways, they're totally right. The Savoir report offers us almost a typology of different forms of acquisition, each of which we need to think through. And in some cases, and here in the Pitt Rivers, I have spent the 14 years actually digging into the archives, into the things. And so the book that came before sort of this one was this incredibly boring book, which is a 140,000 word account. No, I'm sorry, it's a 280,000 word account of 140,000 objects. It's so boring. It's got accession number after accession number. But through doing that, and of course, all sorts of things I would do differently, sort of now, that was 8 years ago that came out. That was the first 5 years of me working here, was hands-on sort of database work. Let's understand what this thing is. For me as an archaeologist, I treated it as a single assemblage, as if it was, it had all just been dug up. And it was an attempt to do what we in the UK would call a post-excavation assessment. Let's see what we've got. Let's just try and make sense of this. So, of course, I completely understand all of us have got, it's most upsetting, obviously, with the human remains, the conversation ongoing at Harvard at the moment, where absolutely crucially, there's a conversation about those who can be identified as enslaved African Americans. And, hopefully Harvard will involve descendant and survivor communities in those conversations rather than only doing the curatorial work. But there are always examples where there's maybe a continent, there's maybe nothing. And yet there is a body which was subject to the work of the museum. So in those cases for objects, I think in some instances we need to lower our standards of evidence. If over 99% of these objects in the UK at least, are not even on display, if we don't have any databases for them, if they're in orphaned collections where there isn't even a curator who has expertise in anthropology, never mind in Africa or other regions, then it's really very hard for us anymore to argue that work of understanding what these things are should not be actually happening, in the source nation, in the source community, or wherever. So, I really think until there's a risk with focusing on the Benin bronzes. I'm very aware that because it's so exceptional that we're going to say, okay, we'll send back the Benin bronzes and that's the end of the matter. And we'd be art washing this whole process, because there are so many other examples that matter. And I know our Nigerian colleagues also are absolutely understanding that the Benin case is iconic for Africa. And so it's important. It's an open and shut case in my view, but it's also the start of a conversation of how we dismantle these, all of the other collections that we're all aware of, where the documentation is much lower.
Katie, I think you're trying to turn us over to the questions.
Yeah, I just want to, I'm so grateful to all of you for this incredible discussion. And I'm excited because I feel like it could go on for hours and hours. And this is we're scratching the surface of such an important conversation, which it is really demonstrated by the incredible number of wonderful questions that we've received from the audience today. So I want to acknowledge that and thank them. And thank you to the panelists who have answered some of the questions in writing as well. Given that we only have, about 15 more minutes left, I'm going to try to consolidate a number of the questions that have come up into kind of one mush together question that hopefully can give you all an opportunity to give some final remarks on kind of this topic of what's next. I'm going to kind of center the question around one that came from Pejula Iwola, which asks, calls specifically out, sorry, my Q&A is jumping around here, about the fact that the request for restitution that's been taken on board involves now an archaeological excavation at the site of the proposed Benin Museum, and that the British Museum is also involved with this proposal to possibly excavate even more from that site. And I feel like this question kind of ties in with a number of other questions about who bears the burden of cost, of responsibility for all of these actions that we're talking about museums having the necessity to take. And particularly I'm thinking about not only large institutions that hold these objects, but also smaller institutions in the global south and around the world. And there's been a lot of wonderful questions too about how to bring in non-Anglophone museums and institutions and countries into this conversation as well, because as you've pointed out again and again, Dan, these belongings have moved beyond kind of where we even imagine that they exist and beyond where we can see that they exist. So that was kind of a bunch of the questions, but kind of at the core of that, I think, is where does the burden lie? What does this future look like? And how can large institutions think about working in collaboration with and with the voice of people outside of those that have been traditionally involved in making these decisions? And I'd love for if each of the panelists can give a brief answer just to one part of that question, that would be great. And then we'll close in about 10 minutes or so.
Can I speak quickly in regards to the British Museum's involvement with the excavation? I think that is not an answer to what is being requested for or being asked for the works to be returned. I think that in excavating the works, again, there is a place that is being prepared right now as we speak, that is getting designed, and LRT is heavily involved in that, whereby when this site is excavated, because we know that the entire place where the museum is going to be, it's historical in the way that you can't just start building there, you know. So they are coming into it is that I think they are going to pay for the excavation or pay some amount for the excavation. In no way, by any way, is that a palliative or a payment for, oh, we are no longer going to welcome the conversation of returning the looted objects. And by no means am I speaking for the British Museum, but I'm just speaking on the ground that I'm a trustee and a board member for the LRT. And, so it's a way that we can't just start building in that place when the time comes for us to build in that place. Excavation and like what Dan referred to as post-excavation survey is going to be done, So these things are not going to be dug up and, oh, they are coming to dig up some more and take back. Nothing is that is going to get out. Nothing is leaving Benin when it's being dug up. It's going to be cleaned and studied and documented. Thank you. That is the only one I have on that conversation.
Well, I guess I'll respond to the general question. And I've always been also curious about the question of, reparations that go hand in hand with repatriation and, the role of the market as you talk about in your book, the role of racial capitalism during colonialism and, how that evolves in a kind of global, within the global economy and within the markets, because, while we have the sort of scene of the crime in Benin City and in many places in Africa, the sort of various tributaries and routes that objects take into collections are so diverse outside of this case. And the conversation around reparations comes up a lot with regard to slavery as well, and the history of slavery. And when you think about the enormous extraction of wealth from Africa, from the British colonies that went into the modernization of the UK and Europe, etc., one can't help but to also think that there are instances where slave owners were compensated for, the end of slavery. And so, of course, there's a lot of hypocrisy in the debate, but, I think that the two should go hand in hand, that's repatriation and reparation and go hand in hand, and that, there are, there's not just an ethical responsibility, but I think there's also, a responsibility to support financially as well. And then I just wanted to comment on museums in the United States. And, I think that here there's also a transition that's happening, an evolution that is taking place. and the De Young is certainly part of that. But in conversations among my colleagues here, African art curators at other institutions, you know, there's a very live conversation about ethical collecting and ethical curating, and, you know, how one can share resources, how one can provide more access, you know, create collaborative research, loans, etc. And also, you know, rethinking this tension between the museum as a repository of objects and a place to which people want to give objects, as well as a place that wants to collect objects, you know, and actively engages. But, you know, in the 2 months that I've been here, I've probably received maybe 3 different emails about people who want to, you know, either donate or be in contact with, etc., because they have an object that they would like the museum to have, for instance, you know. So I think that, you know, what one discovers, of course, is that, you know, the museum becomes constituted over time through all these small actions and all these small interventions. And this idea that there is this kind of, you know, grand plan and grand master that controls it all. And, you know, it's actually the other way around, that the institution becomes built from the ground up through these, you know, little bits and pieces, and, you know, is put together in the way that it is put together today. And so now the challenge is, yes, you know, how do we sort of undo all of that? But I do think that this kind of evolution is happening, and these kinds of transitions are happening. And, you know, I choose transitions and evolutions instead of change, because I think that, you know, these are the kinds of shifts that will lead to changes, and those take place over a long time. But I think the digital and the pandemic has certainly opened institutions up to digital access, to engaging more globally, to, you know, communities that are both local as well as communities that are global. And that has been such an incredible and positive pandemic lining to, you know, this past year, is that the potential for me to, you know, have an exchange with an arts organization in Cameroon and San Francisco, you know, has increased exponentially. And not only online digitally, but also to think about, you know, how we can actually really work together as colleagues and as institutions to share and redistribute, you know, the resources that we do have. Thank you.
And I would add to that, Natasha, that I think one of the most important shifts that we're seeing is public conversations about the things that were secret, and maybe not intentionally secret, but just simply not shared. And the really important point that was made in a ICOM program that I attended by Tukufu Zuberi, who's at Penn, you know, public conversation is one of the strongest way that we can build relationships, that we can be transparent about what we have, that we can connect across communities, that we can restore the voices of those who've been silent in our organizations. And that even this kind of program we're doing today is exactly about that. It's about an exposure of our failures. It's about an exposure of the baby steps we're taking to do better. And I think when we talk about, you know, reaching out to other smaller organizations in the global South, I think that some of us that such as the Fowler, that has the benefit of major money from the Mellon to do this project, that one of the things that we hope will emerge out of it will be some sort of pointers that we can offer in terms of how to do this kind of research and how to share this kind of research, and the things that we've learned along the way that are new to our processes as curators in museums. So this is the incredible thing that's happened, is we're open, we're talking to each other, we're reaching across borders, and, you know, 32 countries are supposedly on this call, which is pretty phenomenal, you know, in my view. So it's a big new world.
Do you want me to go and then you can have the last word, Dan? So I'll just say that I really appreciate this question that's kind of framed around burden, like whose responsibility is it? And that's something that I've come to understand so much more in the past year. I think as a professor teaching these issues, I thought, oh yeah, it's sort of an abstract thing. Of course, we all agree this is going to happen. But one of the first decisions I had to make is who's going to pay for the boxes? And that's a decision I never thought I would be grappling with. And of course, Berkeley is always strapped for any kind of resource, which is part of how Bascom, who collected these items in the 1960s, convinced people to buy them. He was like, we can get a really good deal now. And it won't cost that much money, but it will cost you a lot of money later. So we're always trying to have this kind of capitalist calculus and trying to figure out, Dan, I think your book talks about this idea of capitalist colonialism. And I taught this with my students. I asked them, what should we do? And one of them had this great idea that maybe we have a goodbye party and maybe you have a welcome party. And so the idea is like, how do we shift that affect from being about burden? And like Marla said, the kind of negative of it, that when you say you have something that's stolen, you say, oh, no, I don't. Like, that's the immediate reaction. But what if it's like, well, how do I work to give it back? How do we make this right? And so thinking about that idea of transitional justice and the way it might help us maybe shift this idea of burden and who's going to pay for the boxes. I'm going to pay for the boxes. Okay, we'll figure it out. So how do we move forward?
Okay, wonderful. And so I'm not really wanting to have the last word, because this, I think, is the beginning of a conversation. And it's been incredibly positive to have Victor, to see you. I mean, we're seeing a lot of each other at the moment, Victor, but it's fantastic that you were able to be part of this conversation, and to hear, actually how these ideas are landing in different ways in different parts of the world. So I think, just to pick up on a couple of things, just to sum up, that sense of the museum as a public space. Let's reclaim our anthropology museums as the spaces that we can actually talk about these questions. Okay, they were built to make violence and loss and dispossession last, but that also means they can be reimagined if we're hopeful, and if we dismantle the really hurtful bits, they can be in part sites of conscience, sites of remembrance. And so my colleague Onikachi Wambu has his thing of the 7 R's, and I'm not going to remember all the 7 R's, but certainly reparations is one of them. Although one, I think, that concerns the nation state more than maybe university museums. I don't know. I think in terms of object, there are other debts, without a doubt. But he also talks about, importantly, restitution. And let's just make it very clear, this is not simply about dialogue. This is about seeing objects return to Africa, on a case-by-case basis, helping the claims be made and facilitating the knowledge sort of sharing. But this isn't an endless dialogue, but it's also about remembrance as well. So and he's got all sorts of other R's, recognition and so on. But, we've done this for human remains for a generation. We've done it for Holocaust spoliation for a generation. Absolutely rightly. The Washington Principles moved the onus of responsibility for understanding, what was in the collections from the claimant to the institution that's holding these things. We have underinvested. We need to make the case in terms of our wider institutions, in terms of funders, in terms of international collaboration, that we have neglected African collections for too long. We should understand what's in the collections if we're in any way caring for them. And part of caring for them is to allow them to return, when that is the right thing to do. And I think for so many, certainly for the Benin bronzes, let's see them go back. Wonderful. The final thing, I guess, the book talks about a decade of returns. We're already seeing objects finding their way back from other European nations. None of this happens overnight. Rome wasn't unbuilt in a day, but it can happen at pace. And I think we really need to move now from simple dialogue into action on these questions.
Thank you.
Feely, you're muted.
Thank you, Marla. I want to really thank everyone here. This has been far, as I say, we have to plan another follow-up on this. So we already have our responsibilities, Katie, to move to the next one. I'd like to thank everyone for showing up and being so honest and so straightforward about the issue that has concerned most of us, about some kind of restorative justice to be realized, and that we can move on as better curators, better museums. There are, I know, quite a few questions that have been asked us, and I know you tried to summarize them, but there are 34 fantastic questions here. I think we can forward these questions to each of you, or to all of you, and that you can answer on your own. All right. You know, we certainly we can stay on a little bit more, can't we, Katie? Does it cost us?
You know, I'm not sure. There might be another webinar taking our place after this, but yeah, I mean, I'd love to take some time to thank all of the supporting institutions, if now's the time to do that, and to is it all right if I share everyone's contact information on the screen? Great. So I'm just going to go ahead and share contact information for our incredible panelists today. Like Feely mentioned, we'll definitely make sure to get all those wonderful questions directly to those that they were addressed to. We've had the great support of some people behind the scenes, Martha Saavedra from the Center for African Studies, and Annie Danis, who's an instructor here at Berkeley, consolidating all your questions, so we'll make sure those get to you. So please take a moment to note down the contact information that you see here. I'd also like to take a minute to acknowledge the main sponsors of this event who represent the institutions of the panelists here. You can see their contact information here. I also encourage you, this is, like Feely mentioned, hopefully this will be one of many events in the future. If you'd like to hear more about all of the events these organizations put up, you can follow them on social media or join their mailing lists. Lastly, I'd like to share my contact information as well as Feely's, and really give credit where credit is due to Feely for bringing this panel together and connecting all of these people from all over the globe. Thank you so much for that, Feely, as well as to the many supporting institutions from all across the state who contributed to this event today. We'll post links to some of these institutions in the chat, as well as to the individuals who supported this event. So just as we close, I'm going to bring it back to the contact information for our panelists, just for one more minute to make sure you get those down, and say thank you again to everyone.
Hey, I have one more announcement.
Please, yes.
Yes, for those of you who have not had a chance to get the book, we have, I just talked to the publisher, and that the book has now been reduced to 50%, and that if you want it, you know, simply go there. For the month of February, it's Black History Month. We want to be able to deliver this to you in a cost-effective, way. If you want Dan's signature, and some people really believe in signatures, then just send your receipt for the book back to Pluto Press, and then we will prepare. And Dan, get your pen out. I'll send to you all the signature signed book plates.